All right. So, hello, everybody. My name is Julia, and as Michelle said, welcome to Baltimore Racial Justice Action's 13th of the Month event. As we get started, just a few things. I'm going to also continue sharing. So, of course, since this is a virtual event, we invite you to get a beverage and a snack. Just make sure you have your laptop charger close by so you don't lose any of us, in this wonderful event. Keep some paper and a pen ready in case you want to take some notes, you want to journal, any kind of questions you might want to write down, and set aside anything that might distract you, just so you're living in the actual moment and in the conversation. So as we mentioned, we do these events monthly. So these are some ways to follow us on social media so you can actually see about all the events we offer. We are on Facebook, if you type in Baltimore Racial Justice Action, Be More Racial Justice Action on Instagram, and if you can find our website at bemoreantiracist.org. And if you would like to become a monthly sustainer or make a one-time donation, we do accept those at bemoreantiracist.com/donate. Once again, these are our social media. So please follow us. We are putting up all of our events, any kind of, we have any kind of trainings or just like if you want to work with us, this is a way to find out about those. And of course, we are filming these 13th of the month events like virtually. So if you want to watch them later, you want to go back and redigest information, you can find it on our YouTube, which is like Baltimore Racial Justice Action. So a little bit about us. We are a network of Maryland individuals. We are committed to social transformation with an emphasis on racial equity. And so we were founded in 2003, but we had our roots in the Agents of Change workshops that began in 1996. And we are a program of Fusion Partnerships, which is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. And we offer workshop series for members of the public, consultation for organizations, and as you can see right now, our free monthly dialogue events on the intersections of race and other societal issues. And you can learn more, as I mentioned before, about our public workshops, our consultations, and our 13th of the month events if you visit our website at bemoreantiracist.org. And if you want to support that work, which of course, especially during this pandemic, once again, you can definitely donate or become a monthly sustainer. And we'll probably follow up with this information at the end of the event. All right, Michelle, you got it.
Thank you, Julia. My name is Michelle Dewberry. I am a BRJA facilitator, and I also do the 13th of the month events with my lovely Julia, who helps me out every month. I couldn't do it without her. Today, we're going to be talking about White Women's History Month. And the reason why we're calling it White Women's History Month is because typically women of color oftentimes are left out of the story, often left out of the narrative of this month that is, set aside to honor women in this country. So we wanted to take this time in this space to honor women of color, to uplift women of color, to have a conversation about why is this happening? How does this affect us as a country? How does this affect women of color? How can we dismantle this and how can we move forward and make this month more inclusive? So once again, thank you for joining us in this conversation. And at this time, there were some women that we had on our flyer when we promoted the event, and we want to take a few minutes to honor them and to just talk a little bit about what they did. Obviously, we don't have a lot of time today to talk about their amazing accomplishments, so we hope that you will, be enticed from hearing a little bit about their life's works, that you will take the time to get to know them better. So we will begin that slideshow now. The first woman that we're going to honor today is Monica Roberts. Unfortunately, she left us this past October of 2020, but she was a blogger, writer, and transgender rights activist. She was the founding editor of Trans Griot, a blog focusing on issues pertaining to trans women, particularly Black and other women of color. Roberts' coverage of transgender homicide victims in the United States is credited to bringing national attention to the issue. So when we think about terms like, when we hear phrases like Black trans lives matter, let's remember Monica Roberts when we do that, because she is one of the women who helped bring that to the forefront to us as a culture. Our next woman that we're going to lift up and honor is Assata Shakur. Assata Shakur was a former member of the Black Liberation Army. In 1973, she was convicted of killing a New Jersey police officer in a shootout. She's currently a political refugee in Cuba. She has a book entitled Assata, an Autobiography that I definitely recommend that you read. I'm going to read a few words of hers to you now. I am a 20th century escaped slave. Because of government persecution, I was left with no other choice than to flee from the political repression, racism, and violence that dominate the US government's policy towards people of color. I'm an ex-political prisoner, and I've been living in exile in Cuba since 1984. I've been a political activist most of my life. And although the US government has done everything in its power to criminalize me, I am not a criminal, nor have I ever been. Our next woman that we're going to honor and lift up is Deborah Haaland. She's an American politician serving in the US Representatives for New Mexico's 1st Congressional District since 2019. She's currently nominated to be the Interior Secretary under President Biden, and it would make her the first Native American to ever serve as a cabinet member. So hopefully that gets pushed through, because the Republicans are definitely trying to block it, because she is considered, to be against fracking, and she's considered to be into green energy. So hopefully that happens soon. Our next woman that we're lifting up today is Dolores Huerta. She's an American labor leader and civil rights activist who, with Cesar Chavez, is a co-founder of the National Farm Workers Association, which later became the United Farm Workers. Huerta has received numerous awards for her community service and advocacy for workers, immigrants, and women's rights, including the Eugene V. Debs Foundation Outstanding American Award, the American United States Presidential Eleanor Roosevelt Award for Human Rights, and the Presidential Medal of Freedom. She was the first Latina inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame in 1993. Our next woman that we're lifting up and honoring today is Sylvia Rivera. She was an American gay liberation and transgender rights activist who was also a noted community worker in New York. Rivera, who identified as a drag queen, participated in demonstrations with the Gay Liberation Front. Marsha P. Johnson was larger than life, as you can tell from this picture. She was an American gay liberation activist and self-identified drag queen. Known as an outspoken advocate for gay rights, Johnson was one of the prominent figures in the Stonewall Uprising of 1969. There's currently a documentary about her on Netflix called The Death and the Life of Marsha P. Johnson that I highly recommend. Helen Zia is a Chinese-American journalist and activist for Asian American and LGBTQ rights. She is considered a key figure in the Asian American movement. Pauli Murray is actually a Baltimore native. She was an American civil rights activist who became a lawyer, a women's rights activist, Episcopal priest, and author. Drawn to the ministry in 1977, Murray was the first African-American woman to be ordained as an Episcopal priest in the first year that any women were ordained to that church. At this time, if any of the panel members would like to add any information or insight that they have about these amazing women activists, they're welcome to do so now.
So Michelle, I will start with Pauli Murray. I am reading her autobiography now, and have just so much respect for all of the women who were mentioned. Pauli Murray just resonates with me so much, her life story. But one quote that she shared, which really, really stands out for me, is she says, if anyone should ask a Negro woman in America what has been her greatest achievement, her honest answer would be, I survived.
Mm.
I love her story, her accomplishments, and she is just such a beacon.
Thank you, Adar. Would any other panel members like to share any more about these women?
I'll comment on Dolores Huerta. She still continues to be active in advocating for rights of all marginalized people in the United States. She gives voice, she sends financial support. She is just an amazing woman that has not given up the struggle since the day she started. And she's someone, and she's also really, she's someone that if you run into her into the street, she will stop and chat with you. And, you know, she's just a remarkable woman. And there's a good cocktail named after her too.
Thank you, Christina. Would any other panel members like to share?
Just to add about Dolores, there's a movie about her, a documentary that's really, really good.
Thank you, Dottie.
And I'd love to say a few words about Helen Zia. Also because I had the chance to see her speak at a student organized event at UC Berkeley. I'm in California. And similar to what Christina mentioned, you know, she's just still continuing to fight for not just rights, but liberation. I mean, she's really committed to intersectionality, to understanding deep and staying in touch with young people and building community and continuing to do that. So she's really a hero in the, especially amongst Asian Americans, but for everyone. And I especially appreciate her work around the Vincent Chin case, which was a case in which a young Chinese American was killed, and she led the fight for against police brutality, as well as justice for the Chin family. And there's a great documentary on it as well. I don't know if it's on Netflix, but you can probably find it.
Thank you, Sina.
Michelle, if I can just jump in to say one more thing.
Sure.
When you shared about Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson, it just reminded me of how whitewashed the story of Stonewall is. The Stonewall, what is called the Stonewall riots. And here are two women of color who were front and center in that liberation movement that we never really hear about in the national narrative, and we should. So I'm so excited that that they were uplifted today, as well as Assata Shakur. So thank you for all of that.
Thank you, Adar.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing, particularly about Marsha, who, I think I remember someone saying that the P, when folks would ask about her gender, she would say the P in her name stands for pay it no mind. And I think that, you know, it's so important to understand, particularly talking about trans women, how much work they have done on so many fronts, and that there are stories, particularly Black ones and color ones, end up getting left out of that history. And so when we're talking about women's history, we're talking about, you know, if we're talking about the LGBTQ movement, all of those things, they get left out of those stories. So it's so important to uplift them in all aspects of the work that they've actually done.
Thank you, Julia. If there's nothing else from the panel, we're going to move on to our questions for the panel. So today I'm honored to be joined by people that I definitely admire and love working with here at BRJA on the panel today. I've just met Sina a few days ago, but already, I can see why she's a part of this organization. She's in California, but used to be here in Baltimore, but obviously, thanks to Zoom, can still be very active with us here today. And we have Adar here with us today, who is one of the founders of BRJA and continues to lead us and guide us as we continue to do this work. We have Christina and we have Julia. I enjoy working with them very closely here at BRJA, and yeah, I consider them sisters in the fight. So we're going to move on to our questions for today. And at the end of the discussion, we will be taking questions from the audience. If there's something that comes up as we're discussing, feel free to pop in the chat. I know sometimes people feel like they might forget their question or jot it down, because we will be, the last half hour, we will be taking questions from the audience about this discussion today. So the first question that I have for the panel: in what ways are women of color adversely affected by not being seen or celebrated during White Women's History Month? I'm not sure who would like to take that question first.
I'm looking at Julia because she's smiling.
Oh no, I was really thinking. I was like thinking of some of what I wanted to say. So someone can go first. That's why I was smiling.
Christina?
It looks like I'm going. So what I would say to answer that question is there's so much harm that women of color experience in society in general, that I think it's really highlighted during White Women's Month, because their voices aren't ever integrated. If they are included, it seems like tokenism. It's much more of just, hey, here's this Black woman, or here's this Latina or Asian person that is being celebrated, but it's just a one-off. And it's never a thoughtful, really deep dive into their lives. So essentially, women of color during this month are erased, and they're not uplifted. Like even though we just spent 3 or 4 minutes uplifting these women, the fact that we even mentioned their names is much more than most anybody is celebrating these women around this month. So I think the harm comes with being invisible, because when you're invisible, that means that you're not having access to what you truly need as an individual, as a human, and you can't walk in solidarity with others if you're not even seen. So that's I believe one of the harms.
Thank you.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's also that there's so much missing information and context that happens. So, when I was younger, and you talk about, any kind of like celebratory month, you look for yourself. When you're younger, even when you're an adult, you look for yourself. So like you can point to someone and say, oh, well, I can like listen to this person's story and get something from it. And when you don't see yourself, you can begin to believe that you weren't a part of that story, even though in your bones that's not true. And so the other part of that harm is that the story is incomplete, the history is incomplete, and so you can end up kind of quote unquote believing you're like reinventing the wheel when there's already people there. There's already stories there. There's already work that's been done or is being done that you don't have access to, that you could add to, that you could learn from. And that is harmful. Not seeing yourself and not being able to, and also like not allowing other people to see that like this is not just one thing. So women's history, we always talk about suffragists. That comes up all the time. And yet like no one really wants to kind of talk about like, oh, what's the racial implications of that? Like how that's just different. It wasn't all women. It's like, so, when everyone's putting stones on people's graves or wearing white suits, that gets left out of the narrative, and why maybe I would want to wear a white suit. It's like, and that is a problem. So it just kind of, I think it conflicts every story for everybody's story, and that is harmful.
Thank you, Julia. Any other panel members like to weigh in before we?
Yeah, I'd love to as well. Thank you, because one of the things I'm also thinking about in terms of who was lifted up in our, in the opening and the grounding, is also the erasure of gender fluidity, the erasure of, as Julie already spoke to, it's not just the erasure, but also how we have to fit within this month, right? There's all this, let's try to lift up as many stories as we can and try to become visible. But we only have 30 days to do it, 31 days. Okay, so then after that, the attention is gone, right? And it creates this feeling that we're constantly having to go back and prove that we even existed. And as someone who is non-binary and who is gender fluid, I use they, them pronouns, that just continues this feeling of, I guess it's the impact of that erasure, right? You feel that you have no foundation on which to build, not just your identity, but thinking about, how do we solve these problems? How do I name these problems that are impacting me? All of that wisdom that comes from the life experience of these heroes and all of the others that become erased is cut off from future generations. And because I work in a library and archive, where now I'm in an archive that is full of radical Asian American archives. That's something I just didn't know existed, or, going back to 1600s, I had the myth and the lie, that we weren't there, we were silent, we were quiet, we are just trying to assimilate to whiteness. That's just the entire story, right? All of everything else is cut out, and what that does to young people and future generations also leaves that work to be picked up and done, that is so difficult. So.
Thank you, Sina. I really like what you had to say about the fact that how harmful these narratives can be and how much erasure can happen, that unless we are active about making sure we're really learning the history, that so much can be lost within these narratives that only serve white supremacy. So thank you for that. Would anyone else like to chime in?
I absolutely. I mean, I just love what everybody else has said. So thank you. I'm here with my sisters. So feel just really, really good about that. Want to acknowledge Dottie, because you were talking about me as a co-founding member, and I see that Dottie is here too. So definitely during this month, want to uplift her in terms of the RJA being, a vision of hers, and something that she has curated and been such an engine in growing for all of these years. So Women's History Month, Dottie, for you.
Love you, Dottie.
Sina, Christina, and Julia all talked in some way about the history. And this is what we always leave out, right? America always wants to start everything with what happened yesterday, as opposed to like how things develop. And we know that Women's History Month started as International Women's Day, and then in, I think it was 1908 or 1909, there was an anniversary of a garment worker strike in New York, right? And so that was something that was picked up. And then it was Women's History Week. And then in 1980, Jimmy Carter was the first president with a proclamation that, okay, we're going to celebrate the week. But here's where the history part comes in that we should always remember, that in Jimmy Carter's remarks, he firmly centered this week as being part of America's history as, and get this, a settler nation. He talked about the first settlers who came to our shores. That is very firmly placing this in a whiteness norm frame. Now, in his speech, he mentioned, oh yes, and the Native Americans who befriended them. But yeah, we know how this story ended, right? And that sense of trying to reposition history as if there were an equal relationship and not a whiteness norm in it is very telling. And it is rewriting a history and framing the whole concept of Women's History Week and month in a history that's not true. He then went on to talk about those who struggled for equality. Susan B. Anthony was a person he named, a white woman who totally sold Black people out, Black women and men, as it came to the vote and as it came to their position and standing in America. He talked about Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Stanton. And then he talked about Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman. What the heck do you think that did? Because the way that he positioned them with them as if they were all people working for equity. You know, what is that saying? Shut the front door, because that was definitely not it. They were working for Black liberation, for Black liberation from white supremacy and Black liberation for women as well as men. That's not the same as the white women who were working to get the full 100% benefit of the experience, privilege of being white in America. Those things are not the same. And yet in Jimmy Carter's speech, you know, talking about and celebrating women's History Week and then month, this is how it was being framed. And even now, Julia and Michelle and Sina, Christina, when we talk about Women's History Month, right? And when we frame it as this all women, as long as the story that is being sold and told is centered from the power perspective of white women in this country. And then the gaslighting for everyone else who is not represented, women of color, people who were gender fluid, people who were transgender, right? We're not going to pretend that this month, that the history is the same or even shared, or that white women have not throughout history been working to deny, to diminish the rights of those people who are not included in supposedly all women's history month. We're not going to do that. Hence this panel. And I am so grateful and pleased that you all asked me to be a part of it.
Thank you, Adar.
Adar, just to add on, I think the point of gaslighting is one that's really crucial here, because I think as we walk through the world, we're always questioning, are we doing it right? Are we doing it wrong? Is there someone is judging me based on my skin color or my gender fluidity? Or it's like always, it's always a question of what's wrong with us, rather than what's wrong with society and white privilege and how we look at white supremacy. And that gaslighting, going back to the original question, that gaslighting is so incredibly harmful to our mental health and to the way we engage with each other. And, you know, looking at, and specifically, like I'll say, like Black and brown people and their interactions with each other, we're pitted against each other rather than saying we have the similarity that we're all being oppressed by white supremacy. But that's another way that we're gaslighted to believe that our society wants us to be fighting against each other rather than uplifting, supporting, giving voice, and empowering each other. So that gaslighting really resonated with me, because I know I struggle with that on a daily basis, and I know that I'm not the only one. So that just kind of thank you for mentioning that, Adar.
Thank you,
and even
Christina.
more that erase your age and the idea that people haven't been working together before this. Like, so the idea there weren't Asian people who were for Black, you know, had solidarity with Black people. And yet when you actually go and you read that story, it's like, that's not new. Like those things actually aren't new. It's like, so the gaslighting and then the erasure as like, well, we've always done this and this alone. And it's like, well, that's not true either. It's like, so it just aids in the further kind of separation of what we could be doing versus, you know, like what actually ends up happening.
Thank you. If there's no other comments, we're gonna go on to the next question. Okay. In what ways do we shortchange ourselves as a society by operating strictly within the gender binary when these discussions that center around gender oppression are had?
Start, since I had mentioned this a little bit earlier, but when I think of this question, I also feel like shortchange is the tip of the iceberg. I think it goes so deep, you know, in terms of how it actually confines all bodies, you know, everybody. The gender binary also it's so normalized, right? That it's so embedded in our understanding of what is supposed to be natural, what is supposed to be, right? It's just a given, it's scientific, right? But actually, I think one of the biggest lies that we're living with is the reality of gender fluidity and fluid sexuality that existed before colonization.
Mm-hmm.
And that just is completely, you know, when you hear Jimmy Carter's statement, just history starts with the settling, right, with colonization. And we know that that is not true, but that's another part of the recovering work that we're forced to do, you know, that is so sacred and important. I've been burning sage this whole time that I grew, because there's a shortage here, but just because of the power of these stories, you know, and yeah, before European Christian colonization, there were other genders. There were more expansive ways of thinking. I think about in Chinese, I'll speak specifically for Chinese culture, that in Taoism, you know, there's yin and yang. When you apply a white framework to that, you get the gender binary. But actually what's deeper is that these are sacred energies that are to be balanced and worked with within every body space. And, you know, a lot of the mythical and immortal figures in Taoist culture are gender fluid. And they actually, it's almost like they see that binary or that taking a form as a mortal issue, you know, so many will choose to, so that's just specifically, there's so many histories that have been buried and erased like this. And so I think, yeah, that is one way that it not only constrains the way we think about the world, but I think it blocks and separates us from our divine selves.
Mm-hmm.
You know, how we actually would express ourselves and be in our bodies and relate to other people and humans and beings. It is all blocked by these systems, including the gender binary. And it really oppresses all women, trans, cisgender, and non-binary femmes, because while it's trans women and gender non-conforming people that usually bear the brunt of the violence of having to conform, all cisgender women are constrained by the roles. And you see that in white feminism a lot, you know, just the pushing against these gender roles, right? Well, where does it come from? It comes from this binary, it comes from patriarchy, right? So if they could expand that beyond their, you know, one view, they could see that, you know, this breaking through this is a way to embrace the fullness, I think, of humanity.
Thank you, Sina. Thank you for breaking that down so beautifully. I think I personally get frustrated when I talk to people and they don't understand the parallels, right, between white supremacy and being forced into these gender binaries. A lot of people don't see those parallels, and that this oppression is linked. So thank you for illuminating that a little bit for us. Julia, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say, well, first of all, that was gorgeous, the way you explained it. And I also think what really kind of struck me is about the limitations. And, like, you know, you're not able to fully see people and see yourself, I think, in other ways that are possible. and how that's actually a part of white supremacy, that it's about limiting what, you know, you can be, who you can be, what you can see, and that it just kind of, you know, it fits so nicely in a box. Like, so like when you talk about gender, or you talk about, you know, the gender binary, I have found it's very, very difficult for a lot of people to see beyond you know, what is in front of them sometimes. And so doing the work to understand, you know, like my trans sisters, as I call them, really helps me understand what was kind of possible, just like in life, in the work that we do. So I think it was Angela Davis. She was talking about, you know, who's famous for, you know, talking about prison abolition. And she was saying, you know, trans people are showing you, they are living and walking and showing you that other things are possible. There are other worlds that are possible. And we've got to get outside of our thinking in order to make the world that we want to see, that we feel safe in, that we feel loved in, possible. But we have to break out of that binary way of thinking. And so just like what you were saying really kind of brought that home for me. So yeah.
Thank you, Julia.
Yeah, me too. That what you said, Stina, just resonated so much for me, right? And as a person who grew up in a point in history where it was all about the gender binary, right? I mean, that was what we were inculcated in, straight no chaser. And everything else outside of that was viewed as not the norm and something to be looked at as an oddity. I will tell you this, that we cannot talk about liberation if we are talking about um, um, keeping things that fit into this patriarchal, right, way of thinking, this religious institution way of thinking that denies people the full scope of their humanity. And if we are talking about liberation, and if we are talking about love, then we have to talk about not being open, because there is a condescending tone to that, right? But we have to talk about divesting ourselves of our own self-righteousness, self-importance, feeling that you know, this is normal and nothing else is, to get out of that center, in the same way that we are saying that other people need to do around race, or that other people need to do, you know, around it. And I'm gonna just put this out there: white women feeling that they're oppressed because of sexism. That we have to take that same commitment and fervor and acknowledge that everything, if we're talking about love, then that is the principle and that is the point. And you can't just say, okay, I'm loving liberation about this thing right here, but I'm not loving, my love and liberation only goes to this limit. And when, you know, having people in my life, and Sina, you have been one of them, as you know, and a teacher, having people in my life who are able to help me through whatever blind spots I'm carrying, help me with language, help me with terms and concepts, right? Help me to grow and expand. If I didn't have that journey, I would not be able to sit here with any honesty and talk about liberation or love in the way that I mean both. And so if those are the things that we're committed to, we can't just say that we're committed to them where our comfort level or where our conditioning or where anything ends. We have to acknowledge and recognize the divine in this liberation work that we are doing. That cannot be discounted. And that more than, that's everything, Sina, that I hear you talking about, that we all carry that divine, and the divine isn't just straight cisgender.
Right. Thank you, Adar. Adar, I really like what you had to say about blind spots, and that even those of us who are doing the work, that we have our own blind spots, right? That not only are we doing the work, but we have to constantly be working on ourselves, right? Like constantly be actively decolonizing our own minds because we are a part of this society. So thank you. Thank you for saying that. Were there any other comments on this question?
I just wanted to add a couple of things related to the harm that it brings to have this binary. Like right now across the country, there's so many laws that are being passed that limit children's ability to participate in sports if they're transgendered. Yep. Or the fact that they have to use a specific bathroom, even though it's not the sex that they're representing and feeling and believing. So the harm that it's doing to just another decade, another 50 years worth of raising children, and how that's really going to harm them and their perspective is something that if we and the funny thing is a lot of these folks say, I care for the children, I only want what's best for the children. And once again, they're saying there's only specific children that should be protected, not all children. Yeah. So it's something that today there's even at the federal level, there's a representative that put out a anti-transgender statement saying there's only two sexes in front of the door of a woman with a transgender child. Mm-hmm. And what harm is that? And what is that doing? And that's two women who are in positions of power, and yet they're dismantling each other, or actually one of them is dismantling the other just for her own comfort in what she believes is the right thing. So we're still doing it, and we're still perpetuating and harming our own children. So that's something that we need to, fight against and work to abolish that behavior.
Thank you, Christina. Any other comments from the panel? We'll move on to the next question. So we're discussing, obviously what we think is missing from White Women's History Month. If it were up to you, what would real structural change in celebrating Women's History Month look like to you?
To me, it would look like decentering whiteness in the conversation. So, we are going to talk about the full scope of history. We are going to talk about and recenter the stories, of Sylvia, the stories of Dolores, the stories of Assata, the stories of Marcia. We are going to center those stories, not within this multicultural perspective that is passing for inclusion. So we're going to include you in our story, but the power framing of it is still going to be our story. Mm-hmm. We're going to dismantle that power framing of it as your story, and we're going to talk about the true story of American history and everybody's positional role in it. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about Harriet Tubman, we're not going to, as is done now, talk about Harriet Tubman during Women's History Month as a feminist. During Harriet Tubman's time, there's no way she would be able to walk down the street arm in arm with any white women of that day. Mm-hmm. She was a Black liberationist, and she believed in women, right? But no, she didn't believe in women with the white woman framing of today. We're not going to talk about Sojourner Douglas in that way. We're not going to talk about Marcia Johnson from the perspective of a straight cisgender person, right? We're not going to do that. We are going to talk about the help and the harm. We are going to talk about the fullness of their life and scope and stories. And we're not going to be invested in making in affirming an American mythology as we tell these stories to make people and white women feel good and affirmed and validated. Not going to make them feel bad. We're going to talk about American history in the way that it happened. Those are my thoughts. So, Sina and Christina, I see you shaking your head.
Thank you, Dar.
What's next?
Okay, you got me. Yes, I was speaking vigorously. I agree with all of that, and I had a lot of thoughts swirling around just in terms of, I think real structural change. I'm not sure it would have a History Month component to it. I'm not sure about that. I'd like to have that conversation, with people who are actually dedicated to making real structural material change, because it's not enough to diversify, the hashtag diversity, the Women's History Month, right? These stories, as Adar said, need to be really not just listened to, internalized. We have to allow their lives and wisdom to change who we are and how we believe and what we believe, and that's way deeper than adding a page in a book, adding a chapter in a book, and then just saying, well, I read it, I know the facts about it. No, it's deeper. And I think that's what's left out of the whole structure of Women's History Month. It's not it's predicated on this solidarity that isn't real. Solidarity has not been built. That trust actually is not there. In fact, it's the opposite. We can speak to all the examples of how white women have participated and led, not just followed, but led, in colonization, during enslavement, in all of the phases of this history that we can point to. We can find those examples, so it's not enough to just say, we called it Women's History Month, so now everyone's in there and we're all good. We're not good. We have to actually build real solidarity, which entails changing our worldviews,
Michelle, can I ask like a show of hands question?
Sure.
So would your your reconceptualization, restructuralization, would it be for just 1 month, or if it's just 1 month, raise your hand. No, if it's just 1 month, don't raise your hand. If it's 12 months of the year, that is part of the reconstructualization, that it goes deeper than just a month and into our history books and, into if it's that, raise your hand. Yeah, exactly, right? So this whole thing about restructuring, even when and I love what the depth of your answer, Sina, because you're talking about more than a month. What I hear you saying is, this is jacked. Having a month just restrains us so much. If we're talking American history, then this is in the books, it is in Congress, it is in the state legislatures, it is in the way in which society operates, period.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. I was just going to say that this question actually reminds me about when I was learning about how Black History came to be, how Black History Month came to be. And like what we know about Black History Month is that it's like, oh, we celebrate, our great Black leaders, right? I mean, and that's important, right? That's an important part of the story. But more importantly, it actually was about us learning about those people and the work that was being done, how we could actually do the work. And so I think that part of white supremacy is this kind of like, we celebrate, like, okay, but look, you guys are great, we love you, women are wonderful, and now we're gonna celebrate you. And here are your best hits. Here are these ones who are awesome. And the reality is that gets lost, like when we're celebrating the face, when we're celebrating the picture, the work is being lost. The work that is still happening or needs to be happening gets lost in the shuffle of all of that. So we might celebrate Marsha P. Johnson and say she's awesome, and we might put her up on a picture. Granted, that just recently started happening, and that's because trans people have been pushing to make sure that people know her importance. But if you can't relate her story to the murder of, Black trans women happening currently, then what kind of actual work is being done? If you can celebrate, an Indigenous woman being added to Congress, that's awesome. But if you aren't talking about how their land or the work that they're doing is being like devastated, like that's not solidarity. That's not celebration. Like I think that for me, the structural change would be about the work. And I think that's something that we all can do like individually. And that's some of the hardest stuff because this work has been going on for a very long time. And I love a good picture. I love putting up my monthly pictures of people, but it's nothing if I just put it up on Instagram or put it up for a post and then it's like, okay, well, excuse me, I'm not reading their work. Like I'm not doing the work with them. I'm not reaching out to people. That's a problem.
Thank you, Julia.
So Julia, what you brought up for me is when we talk about the work, and Christina, this gets back to something that you were sharing, right? That if we were interested in structural change, then the piece of legislation that is being put out around trans children, if we were talking about structural change, that would not happen. Mm-hmm. If we were talking about structural change, then there would be no wage gap between the wages of women of color and the wages of white women, or the wages of women of color and white women and the wages of white men. There would not be that gap if we were truly interested in celebrating women's history and also acknowledging, those whose voices are lost. If we are acknowledging this month and if it means something, then this work, as Julia's saying, would be showing up in every single aspect of our society, what we learn in school, our laws and policies, every single thing. So once again, even having a Women's History Month, are we celebrating symbolism over substance?
Thank you, Adar.
One of the things that really brings me into thinking, and something that Sina said also, is the fact that we're not offered the time to digest this history. We're not offered the time. One of the factors of white supremacy is that everything is so intellectualized, and that there's a certain way that you have to behave or feel, and write, instead of being able to experience the movement through emotion and through the work of solidarity. It's always, we're too busy to really be present in the movement, and that there's always something else that's placed upon us that is another hurdle that we have to jump so that we could continue the fight. And it's one of those things that, going back to really digesting and feeling our ancestors as they've moved through the United States and through this history is something that offers reflection and also for emotional growth. And I'm sitting here and I'm saying, how often have I thought that way? How often have I engaged in that own practice and that self-healing to make me stronger so I could continue the fight? Rather, I'm always jumping from Zoom meeting to another, something or another, instead of reflecting on the power that comes from our people and from each other.
Thank you, Christina. Christina, I like that point, because I think there's so much in the history of America, right, that white supremacy, racism, and capitalism are just these things that are they feed each other. And I love the point that you made, that we're kept busy so we don't have time to fight, right? Like that is that is very intentionally happening. So thank you for making that point. Any other comments?
I have one last thought.
Sure.
I want to offer about, I was just thinking about the origins of white feminism, as and we mentioned Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and who was vehemently anti-immigrant and anti-Black and a number of other things. But that origin story, like I feel that part of the structural change is we need to recognize that ending white supremacy is women's liberation. You know, that's what we keep struggling with and going back to, you know, square one, you know, with intersectionality, you know, because it's like ending police brutality is a women and femmes issue, and economic change is a women and femmes issue. This is not the idea that there is feminism over here and other things. That is white. That is why it is called white feminism, because it is disconnected from all of these other systems of oppression that for women and femmes of color, it's impossible to disconnect. Right. And so that is, I feel, you know, this continual gaslighting that's way deeper than just erasing, I mean, not just, but erasing the people and the stories, but then also trapping us in this mindset where we're constantly like, wait, this is not, again, it's with our fullness. Like we just continue to not be able to be in our wholeness as we approach this work of liberation. It just keeps kind of cutting us. Yeah, I hope that made sense.
No, for sure. Thank you, Sina. Any other comments from the panel? I'm going to move on to our last question. If there were one main takeaway that you would want highlighted from this discussion for the audience to take away from this, what would that be? I'll go first, even though I'm not technically a panel member. But I just want to say that I feel like Sina's comment, solidarity that isn't real, to me, I feel like that so encapsulates everything we're saying, like in one comment. And I think it also speaks to the history. There's a book that I've been meaning to read, They Were Her Property, that specifically talks about white women as slave owners, right? That when we think about slave owners, we think about white men, and that how we're not even talking about the history of white women as slave owners. And what does that mean for us as a country? What does that mean for our history? What does that mean for Black, women of color and white women today, right? That so much of this history is not even being talked about. And I think that if we're truly going to dismantle, we have to think about the fact, talk about and deal with the fact that white women and women of color have not been in solidarity with each other. That has not been the history. Yeah. And as much as we want to, have, Google likes to have these banners of, this multicultural women of color, as much as that is pushed in our faces all the time, that is not the reality. So for me, that's the huge takeaway from this discussion.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that mine would be kind of like what Adar was saying about the substance. Well, she said symbolism over substance. But I think it's part of like what I would want to take away is kind of switching those things. It's like kind of getting to the substance over the symbolism. I think that it's high time that we really start divesting. And look, I think that sometimes with these kind of things, the first thing that we do is we turn it into a movement. I think that we have got to start with ourselves. We've got to start with our own, reading and working and researching and doing that work for ourselves. So starting with, and it don't have to be this month, but you can start now and go throughout the rest of the year, whether that be the books that you read, the organizations that you're actually focusing on. It could be like the TV or entertainment that you engage with. Like, how are you learning about other work, other people, and how are you assisting with that? Because we all use the word allyship, but what does that actually mean? And so I think that kind of gets to that heart of doing more substance and having more substance and just the symbolism of the work that we do.
Thank you, Julia.
Do you want to go, Christina, or should I?
You go, Adar, because I have noisy kids running around.
Okay. So I think for me, a main takeaway that I would offer is that if this country were really serious about women's history, white women's history, or the history of those peoples who have been made invisible during White Women's History Month, If this country were serious about it, we wouldn't need a Women's History Month, because our histories, our issues, our welfare would just be a primary factor in every single thing that this country does. It is only because it is not that a month like this is needed. And that is a damning indictment of where America is.
Thank you, Adar. Sina, Christina, did you have something you want to share?
One of the things that comes to mind over the past, let's say, 6 months, we've heard a lot, Black women save us. Black women always save this country, save the democracy. And how telling is that all of a sudden we have to appreciate the work that has been done over lifetimes in this country, that all of a sudden we're saying Black women save us. And then that white women are also saying it too, when it's like, you should be there helping everybody, you know, and instead they're choosing to align themselves with the white men to maintain power of white supremacy. So instead of aligning with what women need, they choose to be white male adjacent and to tie their success and their movement in the United States to a patriarchy that will destroy them as well. So it's something that is really just thought-provoking, and to say, are you allies or are you stepping on my neck? And I think that is the question we need to ask white women, and white women should ask themselves that question as well.
Thank you, Christina.
I agree with all of that, and I would just add that that I'm feeling this. I feel tearful because I think there's so much. There's a lot of different reasons, but I'm feeling that in order to really be allies or accomplices, we could use the term accomplice instead of ally, which is an Indigenous Action Network wrote something around this. But I think a real facing of the history has to happen. And I think I'm tearful because I also didn't know that history and had to find it out myself, you know, and face that. But I'm thinking about adoption, about the histories of war and of civilizing, you know, white women really taking it upon themselves to help civilize, and just all of the pain that's there. And I don't want to dwell there, but I think there just has not been a facing, and that has to happen as part of this building solidarity, you know. And I think the real sad thing is when we're celebrating, but it comes, as Christina mentioned, you're still standing on, you know, someone's neck, but you're celebrating them. It's really a violent kind of act, you know, to celebrate someone, put pictures on them, use them as your background or whatever, you know, that looks like, and then to not be engaged in actually working, using your privilege to work towards their liberation. I think that's a particular disconnect that has to be addressed. That's what I'm feeling.
Thank you, Sina. I like what you had to say about it being violent. Yes, so much of American history is violent, and even yes, when we talk about white women's role in that it is violent. Thank you. If there are no other comments from the panel, I'm going to open it up to the audience. If there are any questions that you might have for the panel, we have about 20 minutes left. If you don't want to ask your question out loud, you're more than welcome to pop it into the chat. But at this time, we will open up for questions to the panel. Sarah?
Thank you everyone so much. I've really enjoyed hearing from everybody today and digging deeper into this. One thing I got thinking about in relationship to how White Women's History Month is presented is the kind of taboo and discomfort with sex work and sex worker rights and sex worker liberation, and how white supremacy culture is something that like has always been interested in controlling Black women's bodies and Black women's livelihood, and what would it look like to kind of disrupt both like respectability and acknowledge how what's sometimes called like the oldest profession in the world or something, and look at like the roles that and be able to talk about it and not with stigma, and thinking of how great it was to see Marsha P. Johnson, who identified or who did sex work, as well as Sylvia Rivera, and just like the work that Black trans women have been doing around sex worker advocacy stuff, and like Tamika Spellman in DC, who's a policy advocate, Monica Yorkman in Baltimore, and who are in their 50s. And when a Black woman's, you know, projected lifespan is 35 years, they are like our elders right now. So I don't know. I didn't know if other panelists had thoughts on like how to, like if, because I don't know, thinking about what's missing, that's something that came up for me. So just wanted to hear from anybody else in the room if there was like thoughts on that.
So a couple of things, not exhaustive, but just in the interest of time. Two things that come up for me. One is, you know, are we talking a profession by choice or a profession by necessity? And that distinction is critical, right? And that's not conversation that we have, nor do we have the conversation about how stigma is class-based and racialized, nor how arrests are, harassment is, rape is within that profession, right? And so those to me are critical core questions, and we can't just separate those questions from the white supremacy in which those questions live and in which people experience that. And, you know, when we talk about the even increased risk for people who are transgender in those professions, or people who are gay or lesbian within those professions, I mean, it is a bigger conversation than quote unquote just the conversation about sex work. So that's the main thing for me. And, you know, I think that would be a great 13th of the month event.
I agree.
For the complexities around those questions.
For sure. Jenny?
I have a question, unless there other people wanted to comment on that. My question has nothing to do with that.
Did any other panel members want to address Sarah's question before we move to Jenny?
I'll just add, yeah, really quickly that I feel like that's so important. Agree about the 13th of the month event. I think that would be really great. And I think this destigmatizing, you know, it's one thing when we talk about the gender binary and patriarchy and we're saying how it prevents us from accessing our divinity, but all that destigmatizing is part of accessing our divinity. We have to rethink sexuality as divine, and people having the power, if they're in that position of doing sex work, as a power, as a divine, you know, and also just supporting that is work. And that is, if we're talking about economic justice and we're talking about women's liberation, then sex work is part of that. And it needs to be centered or lifted up. So yeah, those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Sina. Jenny?
I was just going to go back these are just more sort of thoughts, and I'd love to know people's thoughts. I'm reading Homegoing by Jassy. And for me, I mean, it's just fascinating, painful. It's really hard to read, but it's also fascinating. And I'm learning so much that was not part of my education. It is a great book. And I guess what I'm thinking about, and I guess it's like a both and, because I understand what people were saying, that the gender binary is, it's related to white supremacy. And I think it is important to say that, and I totally recognize the role that white women play in white supremacy. I do. I also think that much of white supremacy is white male supremacy, which is why, like, we're not committed to women's history and having in real women's equality, right? That's in answer to that Adar, what you were saying before. And at the same time, so I'm just thinking about, like, when we go back to what the tribe life was like in Africa when the book starts, and the different tribes and the roles of women. I mean, there was real gender binary there, right? What were the roles of women and what were the roles of men? And that's, and there is still is today in terms of access to education, and, you know, who stays home and who's responsible for the children, and who gets to go to school. So anyway, I mean, I think it can be both and, that, like, yes, we can look at our society and, like, what's the connection between gender binary and white supremacy, but also recognize that there is a greater context for that gender binary as well.
So was the book talking about before colonization, Jenny?
That's what I was about to say.
Was it talking about the continent of Africa or a certain country in Africa?
So it's a region, because it's before there were countries. So it's talking about the Ashanti tribe and the other, there was sort of these, the other very strong tribe that was often in conflict with the Ashanti, or like in competition, I guess, with the Ashanti, the Lefisi, I'm not going to say it right, begin with an L, tribe. So it's like it starts just before the, like, colonization of Africa, and then it's during that time, and it talks, and then basically, like, how those tribes, I mean, the success of the slave trade would not have happened without the help of members of the tribe and certain tribes. So it's looking at both. So, but it starts, the first story, each chapter is a different person's stories within a generation. And so the first story is about a girl, and you do see, I mean, it's historical fiction, but you see what the gender roles are and what's expected of her, and what are the traditions and the ceremonies, and, you know, and things, and women's and men's roles. So it's fascinating.
Yeah. So thank you. So the one caution, or two cautions. Number one is that that is an experience, and of course there were gender binaries, but there also were societies and communities where there weren't. So to take one book or one person's experience and then to generalize that across a whole continent is not accurate history. So
sure, yeah.
I would caution against that. And then my other comment is, you are, you know, right in that white men have the 100%, many of them, because that is also based on class, on gender identity, on education and other factors, that white men could get like 100% of the benefit of being white in America, in a way that historically white women have not gotten 100% of the benefit of being white in America. But what we cannot do and should not do is dismiss the fact that even though white women did not get 100% of the benefit, they got a lot.
Absolutely.
And our ability to recognize both those things at one time, that they were true and happening at one time, and also not to dismiss either point. Because even though, I mean, when we go back to Stanton's days, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Stanton, what they were fighting for was not liberation against white male patriarchy. They were fighting to get their piece of 100% of the benefits of white supremacy. And that's a very different struggle than a liberation struggle and a Black liberation struggle. So what you're saying, Jenny, is that even though white women have never gotten 100% of the benefits of whiteness, and which white women ought to get 100% of the benefits of that whiteness, that's what they fought for. That we can all acknowledge as a panel that they did not receive 100% of the benefits of whiteness, while still holding that they received and continue to receive the benefits of whiteness.
Absolutely.
Even as they continue to struggle for 100% of the benefits of that whiteness.
Yes, I didn't mean to count to imply that we
not taking it that way. We're just putting it within a historically accurate context. That's all. Thank you.
The term gender binary, I think, is another topic that would be really good to have a 13th of the month event, because what you brought up, Jenny, made me go back to Sina's point earlier about the true origin and meaning of yin yang. And that we who have grown up in this country in a very Western European culture have a certain way that we think about that term and gender, period, that can be very different, even in cultures that do have fairly clearly designated roles, but they have a sense of that yin and yang and incorporate that even within those differences. So I think it, like many of the terms we use to try to clarify our thinking and what liberation really looks like, it becomes very complicated when we really get into it.
Dottie, and the same thing that you said about same terms but differences can also apply to enslavement, because there is a tendency to have a false equivalency about people in Africa selling Black people to be enslaved in the Americas, and equivalence of that to what enslavement was like in America. And what we know is that those things are not the same. And that people who were enslaved in Africa did not experience enslavement in the same way, nor generationally in a lot of cases, as happened in America. So there is a danger in making statements that seem to affirm that there is an equivalency there when there is not.
Thank you, Adar. We have about 4 minutes left. I think we might have time for one more question, if there was another question from the audience.
Can I ask a question of the audience?
Sure, Dar.
Okay, so what would, and it's a question that Michelle asked us.
Yeah.
You could restructure Women's History Month. How would it look for you all?
I had one idea while we were, I mean, you know that I kind of am like, get rid of it, you know, in terms of in general. But I was like, what if white women spent that month reading about the ways that white women have been not just involved, and it's not just, again, not just about facts. I'm like, find a journal of a woman of color who's experiencing what's happening. Find material that really shows what it was like, you know, if you're learning about enslavement or you're learning about Native American genocide, because I think it has to happen, and it has to be done in a deeper way. And the instinct to look anywhere else, I think sometimes can overtake that focus, because there's so much there. Even that can't fit in a month, you know, to be honest. But and I think also just grappling with this myth of innocence that comes with white femininity, the myth of innocence and purity and chastity and all of that can be both oppressive, which, you know, that is some of what Elizabeth Cady Stanton, all of these white feminists we've heard of are talking about, but also how that has given such, not just a shield, but a weapon to white women. And we see that when they're calling the police on innocent people, and we see that in so many ways. So I think that would be one idea, is taking that month to focus on that, actually, and then taking the rest of the year to focus on, I'm just kidding. Yeah, I in general, I'm like, let's not put dates on it, because I just don't move that way. I'm you know, ADHD, okay? So a whole month can go by and I just didn't even realize it, you know? So to me, that time constriction is a way that we don't get to fully deeply engage with these issues, because we're trying to push out an event or trying to perform something. So.
Any other comments? Thoughts? I just want to piggyback on what Sina said. I love the idea of, you know, we have these conversations on Black Twitter all the time, Black social media, about how we're not going to just celebrate Black History Month in one month. It's all year. It's a Black year, you know. So I just want to reiterate what Sina is saying about that we should be doing these things all year. You know, if you're a part of a book club, think about the books that you're reading all year, right? Like, you know, whatever little changes you can make throughout the year, throughout your life. Towards decolonizing, towards dismantling. I definitely agree with that. If there are no other comments from the audience or from the panel, it is 2:30. Anthony, would you mind putting back up the slide for donations and social media? I just want to thank everyone again for joining us for this conversation. I very much enjoyed it. We will be posting it on YouTube. So for, you know, if you have, you know, others that you think could benefit from seeing this, please be looking out for that. I was waiting for Anthony to put up. So once again, we are a nonprofit. We're always open to donations. You can donate through PayPal, and please follow us on social media. We will be having these talks every 13th of the month, so be looking out for that and continue to join us for these conversations as we continue to dismantle racism and white supremacy. Thank you everyone for coming today. Enjoy your Saturday.
Thank you.
Yes, get outside.
Thank you.
Nice.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.